So I brewed an average pale ale. Wait, no, that's not right. I brewed a really nice American pale ale loaded with lots of classic American hops, but I brewed the AvgBrü Pale Ale. You confused? Well, stick around. Let's see how it turned out. Let's get brewing. Well, thanks for stopping by. This is Brent from Cascade's Homebrew. So I may have mentioned it before, but I'm a big fan of Brülosophy. A few years ago, as a bit of a brewing slump, it was the Brülosophy investigative articles that gave me a little bit of a spark to get back into brewing, look at improving my process, think about a little bit what I'm doing. And it was the motivation from them that got me into doing a lot of kind of experimental stuff, doing split batches, say yeast trials, different ingredients, isolating variables. You may have noticed that's a lot of the content that's on my channel, and that's a lot of the content I plan to put up in the future. Early on when I was listening to Brülosophy, Marshall talked about the Brü Club. It sounded interesting. Basically, it was this online kind of virtual club, a group of people that were interested in doing experiments, kind of like I was starting to get into. It seemed like an interesting idea, so I looked into it a little bit. Fortunately, it kind of looked like the website and the forum. They were kind of dead. There wasn't much going on there, so I didn't get much traction. Well, recently, a couple guys have stepped up to take the lead on the Brü Club. They've got a really active Facebook page and also Discord server, and they're doing lots of interesting stuff. So if you looked at the Brülosophy site recently, you may have noticed that some Brü Club articles have made it onto the main page. So that's part of where the club's growing. So if you're interested in the kind of experiments that I do here, and you're interested in doing more and meeting up with some more people that are interested in that, well, check out the link below for the Facebook group for the Brü Club. But wait, I thought this video was about an American Pale Ale. What it is, I'm getting to that. So earlier this year, the Brü Club put out a survey about an American Pale Ale ingredients, looking for people to vote on what ingredients they would see in what they call the AvgBrü Pale Ale. Once they gathered the results of the survey, they came up with a base list of ingredients that people could use to inspire their own beers. So the idea was to have a lot of people come up with their own American Pale Ale recipes and brew them. So this is the template that the club came up with. Let's look a little closer at it. So for a base malt, they recommend a 2-row pale malt, which is what I went with. For specialty malts, they recommend medium crystal, say in the 40 to 60 Lovibond range, and some white wheat. So I went with both of those. There was an alternative fermentable labeled flaked oats or none. I went with the none. I figured just the crystal malt and then the wheat with the pale malt would be a good base malt for an American Pale Ale. I wasn't trying to push this into, say, a hazy pale ale. If we look at the bittering hops, they recommend Magnum. Well, I didn't have any Magnum around, so I just picked a clean bittering hop. As far as mid-boil hops, Cascade, Centennial, yeah, those are two hops that I like and I had around, so I went with the Cascade and Centennial as a mid-boil addition. Late boil, flame out, or whirlpool hops, Citra, Centennial, Cascade. Again, three hops that I like, enjoy, I've used, and I have on hand, so I went with Citra, Centennial, and Cascade at flame out. The dry hop of Citra and Cascade, so I went for that as well. There's some other vital statistics. IBU range, that's about a good American Pale Ale. And as far as the yeast, the Lallemand BRY-97, so another perk of the club, I think they have some kind of arrangement with Lallemand or another supplier. So they had a bunch of packs of BRY-97 that they're able to send out to members. So I got a free pack of BRY-97, so that's the yeast I went ahead and used. Target gravity, 1051, 1060, somewhere right around there. So I was targeting the lower range of that. I think I came in at 1055. Mash temperature, 152 to 153 Fahrenheit. Yeah, that's a great temperature, generic temperature for American Pale Ale. Mash length, 60 minutes, that's my standard. Boil length, I think I went with a 30-minute boil on this one. So I thought about taking the BRY-97 yeast, brewing a 5-gallon batch, and then splitting it and trying to head-to-head against US-05. So I did that other split batch where I did BRY-97 against Cali Ale. I thought the Cali Ale was just repackaged US-05, but it seemed like it turned out different than I would expect from US-05. Well, I wasn't able to fit a 5-gallon brew day in, just based on timing, the weather outside, so I did a 2.5-gallon batch on my stovetop and just fermented it with the BRY-97. Well, let's look a little closer at the recipe, the brew day, and then let's come back and let's taste some of this beer. This batch is my AvgBrü American Pale Ale. It was brewed on February 7th, packaged on February 23rd. The evaluation was done on March 14th. This was a 2.6 gallon or 10 liter batch done on my stovetop. The bitterness measured at 38 IBUs and the color calculated to 6 SRM. As far as the calculated recipe statistics, I build my stovetop brew in the bag batches around a 70% overall efficiency. That would have gave me an OG of 1053, then the calculated final gravity of 1011 would have been an ABV of 5.5%. Ended up getting a little bit higher attenuation, which pushed up the ABV and lowered the final gravity. Just a tip for you stovetop brewers: before you get into your brew day, make sure you clean off your stove. I find that little bit of spaghetti that's left on your stove, well, after a full boil, it's going to be stuck there for a long time. I'll put my target water profile up on the screen. The key here really is just boosting up the sulfate a little bit over my base tap water, and also boosting up the calcium a little bit. So I found around 150 ppm makes a beer, a pale ale beer, that I like quite a bit, so that's where I target. A little bit of extra calcium, I think it helps with clarity. I'm never quite sure about calcium numbers per se. So I end up with a sulfate chloride ratio 3.7. So to hit those target numbers, for my tap water, I need to add 2.8 grams of gypsum and then 13.25 milliliters of phosphoric acid. If you're using different water, your additions will be different. I always use a half of a Camden tablet. This helps to remove chlorine and chloramines from my tap water. So I heat my 3.6 gallons of strike water up to 158 degrees Fahrenheit. That would be 13.6 liters at 70 degrees Celsius. The mash for this one was 60 minutes at 152 degrees Fahrenheit or 67 degrees Celsius. The boil for this one was only a 30-minute boil. The grain bill for this batch was about 85% American 2-row from RAR, about 9.5% of a white wheat malt, and then about 5.5% of a caramel malt. In this case, it was the Breeze 40 Levabon caramel malt. After the 60-minute mash was done, I went ahead and moved this pot over to my sink where I could then remove the grain bag. Now I don't go crazy aggressive with squeezing, but it is a good idea to try to extract as much liquid out of the grain bag as you can, otherwise you're just leaving behind wort and sugars. So I usually will let it drain in the colander, and then usually I'll push down on the top to get a little bit more liquid out. I'm not sure exactly what it was, but the wort on this one had this kind of mesmerizing appearance as it was starting to heat up toward the boil. Just before the start of the 30-minute boil, I added my bittering hops. In this case, it was 0.15 ounces or 4 grams of Warrior. With 15 minutes remaining in the boil, I added a 1/4 ounce or 7 grams each of Cascade and Centennial hops. With 10 minutes left in the boil, I add 1 gram of Irish moss. Honestly, I'm not quite positive what Irish moss or Wurflock tablets actually do to a beer, but it's kind of a habit of mine. As the 30-minute boil winds up, I add my flame out hops and then turn off the heat. The flame out hops for this one are a 1/4 ounce each or 7 grams of Citra, Cascade, and Centennial. I'm sure to mix them up well. The hops will end up steeping in the hot wort for a few minutes while I check my volume and take a gravity reading. I find I don't want to rush this chilling too fast, otherwise I may not get extraction from my flame out hops. I then use my immersion chiller to cool the wort down to pitching temperature. My goal here is to pitch around 66 degrees Fahrenheit or 19 degrees Celsius. At first, I circulate cold tap water through the wort, and then I switch the pump and immersion chiller over to circulate ice water. I then transfer the wort into my 3-gallon per monster fermenter. I find that this strainer does a pretty good job of separating out the majority of the hop debris, keeping it from going into the fermenter. I then pitch the entire pack of BRY-97 just by sprinkling it on top of the wort. I take a gravity reading. I measure 1055. That was just a couple points above my target. At this point, the wort looks a little cloudy, but it's a nice color for an American Pale Ale. I moved the fermenter into my chamber set to 66 degrees Fahrenheit or 19 degrees Celsius. By the 24-hour mark, I saw vigorous signs of fermentation. On day 10, with fermentation winding down, it was time for the dry hop. I added a 1/2 ounce or 14 grams each of Citra and Cascade. I usually plan a dry hop about 2 days before a cold crash, so with logistics on this one, and another brew day that was taking over my chamber, ended up being about 5 days between the dry hop and the packaging day. I'm not positive if this beer got cold crashed or not, but on day 16, I did a closed transfer into one of my 10-liter torpedo kegs. So looking at the actuals for this one, so my original gravity was just a couple points above my target, so that was at 1055. As far as attenuation, I got several more points of attenuation. The plan was 77% attenuation, but I actually got 85% attenuation. That meant my final gravity was down at 1008, which gave me an ABV of 6.2%. 6.2% is a little higher than I usually target for an American Pale Ale. Will it have any character impact? We'll see, but talking with other people in the Brü Club on Discord, it seemed like 85% attenuation with BRY-97 was pretty common for this batch. So I've got a bottle here of the Pale Ale that I'd filled off the keg. I'd kicked the keg already, so a good thing I have some of these around to sample. Let's go ahead and crack this one open, pour it in a glass, and let's see how it turned out. Well, there it is. It's really a beautiful beer. So if we look at the color on this one, I would call it a kind of a light golden beer, maybe golden. It's a really nice color for a pale ale in my view. The yeast definitely has dropped quite clear. It's going for aroma. They used a lot of classic American hops, so we used some Citra in there, some Cascade, and some Centennial. So the aroma is light citrusy, kind of what you expect from a pale ale. So we're going for a taste on it. So the first thought is I can tell it's more of a classic pale ale. The hops are not overwhelming, but they're definitely present. I get that citrusy kind of character. There's not a particular citrus that kind of jumped out to me. Sometimes Cascade, I think, and sometimes it can lean a little bit grapefruity. Sometimes it can lean very kind of orangey. So it's got a nice balance, I think, between the flavoring in there with some Centennial and then the Cascade and the Citra that were both late boil and the dry hop. You know, they're very present. I would say the bitterness level is there. It's present. Definitely tells you that this is, you know, it's got a hoppy bite to it, but it's not overpowering. Mouthfeel on it, I'd say it's there, it's present, it's kind of medium light. It's not overly thick. It's also not a real thin drinking beer. I mean, look at the head sticking around. Usually it sticks to the glass quite well. I'm not sure if that's just in general from the beer or how much the wheat adds into that. It's got a little bit of a kind of grain complexity to it for a fairly simple grain bill. Again, it was just 2-row, some Crystal 40, and then the wheat. I don't usually think wheat is adding much as far as flavor, but it's got a really nice, I've really been happy with the raw 2-row I've been using. I'm going to try to stick with that because I think it's got a nice clean flavor with just a hint of some malty complexity to it. So what do I have some overall thoughts on this? Let's say if we look at the grain bill on this for an American Pale Ale. This one is very close to American Pale I've made in the past. So I've been kind of working on lightening up an American Pale Ale recipe, so it's not quite as malty as Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. But I do think crystal malt in an American Pale Ale is a really good component that fits in well with the style. I think crystal malt sometimes gets a bad rap. Some people say it's maybe too sweet. I think if you're good with your oxidation control, avoiding oxidation of beers, I think you can create really nice, clean beers with crystal. So I really think some crystal malt around the 6%, maybe a little bit more of like a Crystal 40 works really well in an American Pale Ale. The wheat malt, I don't know if it needs to be in there. I'd be interested in brewing the same recipe or a very similar recipe and leaving out the wheat, see if I notice a difference, see if that impacts the head or the lacing on the beer. So what about the hop character in this beer? First thing I'd say, it's hard to beat some of those classic American hops. They really are classic for a reason. They make a pretty good beer. So as far as the IBUs on this one and the bitterness, I think it's pretty well in line with what I like in an American Pale Ale. It might be a little bit on the high side, but not too far off. So as far as the timing of the additions, I see a lot of people really pushing to flame out hops and not doing any boil additions. I really think those like 15-minute, they add a good classic American hoppy kind of character into a beer. So I think it's needed, and I like it in both the American Pale Ales, American IPAs. For say something like a New England IPA or a really juicy one, you may move everything into say either flame out, whirlpool, dry hop additions. But I do think those 15-minute boilish, that kind of that range, 10, 15-minute, I think they add some character to a beer like this. So I think there's really nice aromas and flavors. It's not overpowering. You know, it might be pushing into what used to be in an IPA, but these days pale ales are pretty hoppy and IPAs are really hoppy. Sometimes I'm not sure what the dividing line is between an American Pale Ale and a session IPA. In my book, a session IPA is probably a little bit lighter body, a little less malty than this, and maybe a little bit more hop punch in the nose. So while this one has a little bit of that sort of classic IPA character, I would call it American Pale Ale. Even though the ABV's kind of crept up, it's really getting into where I think the IPA range is for alcohol content. So what about the yeast choice for this one? The Lala BRY-97. Well, I don't have any complaints. It's got a lot of nice classic American Pale Ale kind of beer character. So it would be interesting to do a side-by-side with US-05 versus BRY-97. See if I can tell any difference. The US-05 is a little bit cheaper, and it's usually more readily available. Every place has the fermentus. I don't see the BRY-97 quite as much. The one note about the BRY-97 was the over-attenuation that we hit. So on the Discord server for the Brü Club, a lot of people were reporting that that's what they were getting, right around that 85% attenuation that I got. That was end up pushing the ABV up higher. Does it impact the character of the beer? I'm not sure it does. I like my American Pale Ales to be more in the 5%, 5.5% range. It just makes it easier to drink a little bit more of them without getting, too drunk. But since the original gravity on this was 1055, I think 1050, 1055, that's kind of a sweet spot for making a good flavorful beer without worrying about getting too thin. So I would say the original gravity on this one was fine at 1055. The little lower final gravity, I don't think it really impacts the character of the beer that much. I could tell myself that it's maybe thin and alcoholic, but I don't really think it is. I think that would just be a bias of me as a brewer, knowing all the details about the beer. So American Pale Ales, they're my jam. It's probably the beer I've brewed the most. I really like this one. Well, what will other people think? Well, in cooperation with Brülosophy, the Brü Club organized to send 10 beers to the Brülosophy members and have them taste them. It's part of a future podcast. I was selected for one of those. So as of this recording, 2 beers are in the mail out the way to California. I'd be kind of curious to see how it turns out. I'm not quite sure if they'll be able to get some good content, but there's the idea, is to do an evaluation of 10 different pale ales brewed with a similar recipe. I think they want to come up with some feedback, maybe vote on a best one. It'll be interesting to see how it turns out, see how the other brewers did, see how they like mine, see how it compares. My hopes is that there's a good variety, both in the style of beer, maybe some that are a little bit more hoppy, maybe a little hazy, some that are more classic, and then a mix of some quality, maybe some really good examples, maybe some flaws in some that they can talk about to make it interesting, and hopefully mine will do well. It'll be interesting. If the podcast does go live, I'll go ahead and make sure I put some information down below. So if you like this grain to glass video, make sure you check out this playlist. So for some of my other great grain to glass videos, also check out this video. And if you like this video, make sure you subscribe. That way you'll be notified of my future content when I do more similar stuff like this. Well, I hope this content will help you get out there and build some great beer. Cheers!